Everyone laughed as the white millionaire mocked the black cleaner, until she replied in French. The morning light in Charleston arrived soft and golden, filtering through the wide windows of the Magnolia Grand Hotel like honey poured over silk. Outside, the air was thick with late summer heat, but within the polished marble belly of the hotel lobby, cool air hummed through the vents, carrying faint notes of lemon polish, fresh lilies, and the distant aroma of roasted coffee from the cafe beyond the concierge desk. The floors gleamed with a mirror shine, and each step from a guest's leather sole echoed faintly, reverently, as if the building itself whispered reminders to tread with wealth and restraint. There was a stillness to the rhythm of the morning, not silence but order. Bellboys in crisp uniforms rolled carts with well-practiced ease. A doorman nodded at every arriving guest with the precision of a conductor, acknowledging a familiar note. Near the reception desk, a couple from Boston debated spa treatments, their voices barely rising above the gentle strains of classical piano floating from hidden speakers. And just off to the side of the room, where the foot traffic slowed and polished wood columns rose like silent sentries, Miss Eleanor Grace moved. She was bent slightly at the shoulders, not from pain, but from decades of quiet work. A white kerchief tied neatly over her curls, soft grey uniform pressed, shoes worn smooth at the heel. Her hands moved in steady, practiced circles over the marble with a mop so clean it looked ceremonial. She made no noise, drew no attention. To the passing guest, she was part of the lobby itself, as essential and overlooked as the crown molding. Eleanor's face held the patience of someone who knew how to wait, eyes soft but not tired. A woman made of still water and stone, and in that slow dance of cloth against floor, of polished silence and footstep music, time stretched like a sigh. Then came the laugh. It cracked through the air like broken glass, sharp and deliberate. Heads turned. Near the grand piano, not the hidden speakers, but the real one, polished black and silent, stood a woman carved from old money and sharper memories. Charlotte Kingsley, widow of industrialist Harold Kingsley. Pearls tight around her neck, each step of her designer heels a punctuation mark. Her hair was pinned into an architecture of control, her lips painted with the exact shade of crimson that said, "Notice me, but not too closely," and she was laughing. Not the laugh of delight or surprise, but the laugh of someone who had grown used to being the loudest in the room and enjoyed it. Her hand gestured vaguely in Eleanor's direction, her voice bright and brittle with condescension. "Darling," she said, and her voice carried. "They let anyone walk in here these days, don't they?" For a moment, the world didn't move. Then, a ripple, soft chuckles, awkward glances, eyes darting between Charlotte and Eleanor, like birds startled mid-flight. One man near the elevator looked down at his phone. A woman near the concierge feigned distraction with a brochure, but no one, not a single guest, said anything. Eleanor stood still, her hand on the mop, her gaze lifted slowly to meet Charlotte's. No blink, no smile. The hush in the room was sudden, cold. She was not supposed to speak. That was the unspoken rule. But then Eleanor Grace opened her mouth, and what came out wasn't a protest or a plea. It wasn't anger or sorrow. It was music. Words like silk, soft and precise, spoken in the kind of French that did not come from textbooks or tourist guides, but from poetry. Her voice, low and resonant, filled the space where laughter had once echoed. Charlotte's smirk faltered. Her eyebrows lifted just slightly, the tiniest crack in her painted armor. "Was that French?" she muttered, as if the language itself had no right to come from someone with a mop. A man near the fireplace leaned forward, his expression suddenly curious. "That accent," he whispered to no one. "That's not just French, that's Parisian." Around the room the air shifted. The murmurs began, light as falling petals, but with the weight of awakening. Did she say something about stars? What did it mean? Who is she? Eleanor did not elaborate. She simply returned to her work, her hands graceful as before, but her silence now thunderous. And in that silence, the enigma took root. Because nothing about Eleanor, her posture, her shoes, her humble station, explained the elegance of her tongue or the confidence in her tone. It didn't belong. It didn't fit, which is exactly why no one could look away. The old rules of the room, Who was seen, who was ignored, who was allowed to speak, began to bend. Something had been cracked open, not just in Charlotte, who now stood strangely quiet, but in the very walls of the hotel, in the marble that remembered every footstep and every silence. Eleanor had stepped through a line no one else had dared cross, and she had done it without raising her voice. She had revealed just enough, a single layer peeled back, to unsettle the picture of who she was supposed to be, but that was only the beginning. Something had shifted, permanently. The lobby had felt it. The guests had felt it. What they did not yet know was that this moment, a laugh, a woman, a phrase in French, would be the thread that pulled at everything. And nothing, from that morning forward, would ever be the same. The hotel lobby, just moments before lively and indifferent, had turned into a stage holding its breath. Guests still clutched their espressos, their conversations paused mid-sentence, eyes flitting from Charlotte Kingsley's frozen posture to the figure of Miss Eleanor Grace, who now seemed to stand not in submission, but in quiet command. The mop still rested in her hands, but the balance of power in the room had shifted in a way that no one could quite name, though they all felt it. It was not a speech that had caused it, not a dramatic confrontation or raised voice. It had been something far subtler, more disarming than confrontation. It had been French, not just French, but a sentence carried with the melody of poetry and the stillness of truth. Eleanor had said, "Même les étoiles se fatiguent d'être regardées sans être connues." Even the stars grow weary of being watched without being known. The weight of the words settled over the room like evening mist, and no one quite knew what to do with them. Charlotte, for her part, blinked. Once, twice. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. She gave a half laugh. This one far quieter, brittle even, but the room no longer followed her cue. There was no shared mirth, no echo of superiority, no appreciative glances to validate her amusement. Her laughter had become a question, one no one wanted to answer. A child's voice cut through the silence. "Mom, what did she say?" A woman shushed him gently, not out of irritation, but reverence. Something rare had happened, and the room instinctively knew to protect it. From behind the front desk, the concierge, normally immune to surprise, watched Eleanor with new eyes. She had walked this lobby every day for 17 years. No one had asked her name until today. No one had wondered where she came from. And yet here she was, speaking as though she had walked out of a Parisian novel instead of a janitorial closet. Near the fireplace, a man with silver hair and a navy blazer leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "That accent," he murmured, more to himself than anyone. "It's not learned. It's lived." He looked at his wife, who nodded slowly, her eyes still on Eleanor. "She's been there. That woman has lived things we couldn't guess." The murmurs began again, not the aimless, trivial chatter of tourists, but the beginning of curiosity, genuine and wide-eyed. One woman turned to another and whispered, "Do you think she was a teacher?" Another said, "She speaks better than my daughter's professor." Another, "She looks different now, like someone else entirely." Eleanor, for her part, said nothing more. She didn't perform, she didn't explain. She simply continued her slow, methodical swipes across the floor, but now each motion seemed deliberate, purposeful, like the rhythm of a ceremony rather than a chore. She didn't rush, she didn't hide. She simply was, and that simple being unsettled something inside the watching guests. Charlotte had returned to her chair, her spine stiff, her cheeks burning with something she hadn't felt in years, uncertainty. Her world had always been predictable, composed of clear lines between those who were noticed and those who served. But now she was no longer sure which side she belonged to. She watched Eleanor closely, as if trying to memorize a face that had always been there, but never seen. At the far end of the lobby, seated near the windows that overlooked the blooming courtyard, sat Elizabeth, elegant but unassuming, wrapped in a pale green shawl that matched the color of sea glass. Her eyes, warm and knowing, had not left Eleanor since the moment she spoke. There was no surprise in her gaze, only recognition, not of identity but of spirit. She had seen that kind of quiet strength before, in war rooms, in mothers holding back tears at train stations, in old letters folded neatly into drawers. Eleanor passed by her, and Elizabeth gently reached out a hand, touching her wrist with a feather-light gesture. "Would you," she said softly, her voice husky with emotion. "Sit with me for a moment." The words hung in the air like an offering. Around them, the guests grew still again. It was not a command. It was not pity. It was something far rarer, invitation, one that crossed the unseen lines of class, age, and expectation. Eleanor hesitated for a breath. Then, with the grace of someone who had once moved through parlors and poetry readings, she placed the mop aside, untied her kerchief, and took the seat across from Elizabeth. The sound of the hotel faded slightly, as if the walls themselves were listening. Elizabeth smiled gently. "That phrase you said," she began. "Did you write it?" Eleanor gave a soft, almost shy smile. "No, but I wish I had. It was something my professor said once when we were studying Baudelaire. It stayed with me." Elizabeth nodded, then asked a question no one else had thought to voice. "Where did you learn to speak like that?" The air shifted again. Eleanor looked down for a moment, not with shame, but with the weight of memory. "In Paris," she said simply. "I had a scholarship, literature and philosophy." Gasps were muffled, but felt. Someone dropped a brochure. A man near the bar sat up straighter. Elizabeth's eyes softened. "Paris," she echoed. "You lived there?" Eleanor's fingers touched the locket at her chest. "Yes, for 3 years, until—" Her voice trailed off, and her eyes searched the window. "Until I had to come home. Life changed." She did not elaborate. Not yet. But in her pause there was the suggestion of loss, of choices made for love, of promises kept in silence. The spell of the moment deepened. "I raised my daughter here," she added after a while. "Alone. She's a doctor now, a good one, brilliant. I cleaned to put her through school." Her tone carried no apology. No need for sympathy, only pride. Deep, glowing pride that lit her features from within. A woman at a nearby table pressed a tissue to her eye. Another clutched her purse tighter, as if anchoring herself to something solid. Eleanor looked back at Elizabeth and said gently, "You asked me to sit. Thank you." Not many people would have. Elizabeth reached across the table and took her hand. "Then more of us should start." Their hands stayed clasped for a long moment, and all around them, something was melting. The old assumptions, the lines that once separated us and them. It was slow, delicate work, but the room was different now. Warmer, more alert. The marble didn't just reflect light anymore, it seemed to reflect humanity. No one had expected this. No one had walked into the Magnolia Grand that morning thinking a janitor would sit beside a guest and speak of philosophy, of Paris, of perseverance. And yet, it had happened. Without announcement, without permission. Eleanor had spoken, and now the world was listening. What none of them could have known, what even Eleanor herself did not yet realize, was that this conversation, begun with poetry and humility, would ripple far beyond the walls of that hotel. It would bend paths, soften hearts, and reach across years and cities. It had already begun, and from this moment on, nothing would return to the way it had been. The clock above the fireplace chimed once, subtle and elegant, like everything else in the Magnolia Grand Hotel. But no one seemed to hear it. The soft golden hour of the morning had begun to deepen into something warmer, casting light through the tall lobby windows in long slanting beams that turned dust into sparkle. Outside, the sounds of Charleston stirred softly. Distant seagulls over the harbor, the clatter of a streetcar rolling across iron tracks. But within the hotel walls, time had thinned. A sacred quiet had settled, not of silence, but of reverence. Eleanor and Elizabeth still sat together near the window, the gentle murmur of their conversation now attracting quiet glances, the way one watches two violinists tuning in harmony before a concert begins. Something unspoken had drawn them together, something far older than the hotel or the day itself. It was not friendship, not yet, but it was kinship, women who had lived long enough to know what it meant to be underestimated, to be overlooked, to hold oceans of memory inside a single nod. Eleanor's hands rested in her lap now, fingers lightly brushing the gold locket that hung just above her sternum. The mop and bucket remained where she had left them, untouched, forgotten for the first time in years. No one asked her to return to work. No one dared. Her presence had shifted from invisible to impossible to ignore. Elizabeth studied her face, the smoothness around the eyes that only came from years of observing more than speaking, the delicate lines near her mouth that hinted at quiet smiles shared in kitchens and churches, not parties and galas. "You have a scholar's way of speaking," she said softly, "but also a mother's eyes. I imagine you've seen things that books don't teach." Eleanor gave a small, closed-lipped smile. "I've seen love come and go," she said, "and I've seen a child take her first breath. I've seen the sun rise over Montmartre and set behind hospital curtains. I've seen promises break and faith mend them." Elizabeth reached for her hand again, and this time Eleanor didn't flinch. Her skin was soft, thin and warm, familiar like holding a hymn. The moment stretched, then Eleanor's voice returned, measured, calm and smooth as river stone. "I was 22 when I got the letter," she began, and the room once again leaned in. It came in a cream envelope with an embossed seal. I remember turning it over twice before I opened it. My hands were shaking. I thought maybe it was a mistake. She paused, her eyes far away. "It was a full scholarship," she continued, "to study literature and philosophy at the Sorbonne. I had written essays no one read. I had dreams no one noticed. And suddenly, someone in France saw something worth watering. Someone near the concierge let out a faint sigh. A young woman holding a tray at the bar stopped moving, frozen mid-step. Even the pianist, tucked in the far corner of the lounge, stopped pretending to practice. Eleanor looked down at her lap, fingers moving as if reading Braille from a past that had left no paper trail. "I left Charleston with one suitcase and a borrowed coat. My mother kissed me on the train platform and said, 'Don't speak too loud, and don't let anyone tell you who you are.' I held that close in every classroom I entered." Elizabeth's voice was barely above a whisper. "And what was Paris like?" Eleanor's smile came slowly this time. Rich, wistful. It was everything I'd dreamed. Bookstores on every corner, cigarette smoke curling out of cafes like ribbon, old men arguing politics over espresso, and the language. Oh, the language was velvet. I used to walk the Seine at night reciting poetry aloud, like a girl in a film. It felt foolish, but I didn't care. I was in love with everything. She paused again. Her gaze drifted upward, as if watching something no one else could see. "But then life," she said simply. "Life calls you back." No one dared interrupt. The air had grown thick with reverence, like the hush before communion. "I met a man," she said, "a kind man, American, a soldier on leave. He brought me violets and listened to me quote Camus. He said I was the smartest woman he'd ever met. We dreamed of staying in France forever, but dreams—" She stopped herself. He was sent back. He never returned. A letter came. One I never opened. I still have it, unopened, in my drawer. Some truths are easier to carry unopened. A gentle rustle moved through the listeners, guests who now felt less like strangers in a hotel and more like women gathered in someone's living room, clutching teacups with trembling fingers. "I came home because I was pregnant," Eleanor continued, "and because I couldn't afford grief in a country that wasn't mine. I raised my daughter on books and lullabies and prayers. I cleaned houses, then offices, then this hotel. Every mop stroke, every polished floor. It wasn't defeat. It was investment. I put my past into her future, and she rose. My Ava rose. The name floated like perfume. The room was still. Someone sniffled. Elizabeth, unable to hold her silence, whispered, "And she's a doctor now." Eleanor nodded once, the movement as graceful as a bow. "Yes, pediatrics. Johns Hopkins." A wave of emotion swept the room. Some women touched their chests. One man cleared his throat and looked out the window, blinking fast. Charlotte Kingsley had not moved. Still seated near the grand piano, her eyes were fixed on Eleanor, but something in her face had softened. Gone was the mockery, the superiority. In its place, a confusion she didn't yet know how to name. She had known women who traveled to Paris, but they were wrapped in silk and escorted by money. She had never considered that someone who polished her shoes might have walked those same streets, held those same books, spoken with the same depth of soul. And now she couldn't stop wondering what else she had missed. About Eleanor, about everyone. Eleanor returned her gaze to Elizabeth, and in a tone gentle but firm said, "I never needed anyone to applaud me. I just needed someone to see me." And suddenly, what had begun as a humiliating moment for a janitor had become something sacred, not spectacle, revelation. Guests were no longer looking at Eleanor as someone to pity or to elevate, but as someone they had missed entirely. Her life had unfolded in silence, just beyond the range of their hearing, until now, until she spoke. And though her voice had returned to quiet, its echo lingered in the room, circling gently through the marble halls and into the hearts of every woman old enough to recognize the weight of sacrifice, the beauty of restraint, the fire hidden behind folded hands. Because something had changed, not just in Eleanor, in all of them. The Magnolia Grand Hotel had never known a hush like this one. It was not the polite quiet of polite society, nor the idle lull of guests waiting for taxis and luggage carts. This silence was alive, charged, carrying the weight of something revealed and something about to unfold. People shifted in their seats, but they did not leave. No one wanted to break the fragile thread of presence that had gathered around Eleanor Grace, the janitor who, in one simple morning, had become the center of the room. Eleanor herself sat with her back straight, though not rigid, her palms resting on the table beside Elizabeth's shawl. Her face was calm, her breath steady, but inside her chest her heart beat with a rhythm she hadn't felt in decades. Not since Paris, not since the days when her words had drawn nods from professors, not since her voice had once mattered in rooms where ideas were weighed heavier than fortunes. She hadn't expected it to matter here, in this hotel lobby where her work was invisible, her presence assumed and her story unknown. Yet here she was, being listened to. Elizabeth leaned forward, her eyes glistening with quiet tears, and said with a tone both maternal and reverent, "Would you tell me more, not just about Paris, but about you, about the woman behind the mop?" Her hand reached across the table, resting on Eleanor's with an ease that was both daring and tender. The contact was brief, but it landed like a bell toll in the stillness, clear, undeniable. The gesture itself was radical, a guest reaching across the invisible divide to touch the hand of the woman who scrubbed her floors. The room held its breath. Eleanor hesitated. For a heartbeat, her old instincts warned her, "Stay small, stay quiet, do not disturb the order of things." But there was something in Elizabeth's eyes, something that told her she wasn't being pitied, she was being honored. And so, Eleanor exhaled slowly, a long breath that carried 17 years of swallowed words. Then she nodded. "I went to France with nothing but paper dreams," she began softly, her voice gathering strength as the words unspooled. "But when I returned, I carried something heavier than books. I carried responsibility. My daughter needed me to be both mother and father, to be both provider and protector. So I put aside my notebooks and picked up a mop. And I made peace with it." Heads turned toward her, bodies leaning closer. The staff at the reception counter were no longer pretending to shuffle papers. They too were listening. The bartender, usually polishing glasses with rhythmic disinterest, had frozen mid-motion, his towel suspended in the air. Even Charlotte, seated by the piano, could no longer maintain the mask of indifference. Her chin rested in her hand, her gaze fixed on Eleanor, as if trying to decipher something she'd never encountered before. Elizabeth's lips parted in awe. "And your daughter? You raised her alone?" "Yes," Eleanor said with pride that softened the edges of her tone. "Ava, she was my sunrise after the longest night. I worked shifts that stretched into dawn. But when I saw her eyes, I remembered why it mattered. I promised myself that she would never feel the limits I felt. She would never be told she didn't belong in certain rooms. And now, she wears a white coat. She heals children. She does what I only dreamed I could do." The mention of Ava spread through the lobby like a warm wind. Guests who had once looked at Eleanor as background now leaned forward, imagining the little girl in graduation robes, imagining the sacrifices folded into that success. A woman near the bar dabbed at her cheeks. Another, clutching her pearls, whispered, "My grandson just graduated too." The story connected not through pity, but through recognition, through the universal thread of motherhood, of giving up pieces of oneself to build something brighter for someone else. Elizabeth pressed her hand gently again. "You gave her wings." "No," Eleanor corrected with a humble shake of her head. "I gave her roots. The wings she grew herself." Her words struck something deep, especially among the older women in the room. They knew the truth of it. They had carried that same burden in silence, sacrificing dresses they could not afford, meals they quietly skipped, dreams they folded into the corners of quilts while their children slept. And here was Eleanor, giving voice to what they had all known. That motherhood is not just love. It is labor. It is sacrifice. It is faith, stitched into the ordinary. Charlotte shifted in her chair. For the first time in years, her heart felt the sting of recognition too. She remembered her own daughter, now distant. A woman she had showered with gifts but rarely with listening. She remembered the way she had measured her worth in society's gaze, not in the silent work of nurturing. A pang of regret rose sharp and sudden. She turned her eyes away, but Eleanor's words had already pierced the armor. The guests around them began to whisper again, but these were not idle murmurs. They were words of respect, words of awe. "She's extraordinary," one said. "All these years and we never knew," another muttered. "How many lives have stories like hers?" someone asked softly, almost to themselves. It was as if a veil had been lifted, not just from Eleanor, but from the way they saw every person who served them. For the first time, the janitor was not an invisible fixture. She was a mirror showing them their own blind spots. Elizabeth, with her gentle poise, leaned back slightly, her voice carrying across the room with unplanned authority. "Perhaps," she said, "we have all been guilty of seeing without knowing, of walking past stories worth hearing." She turned her gaze deliberately toward Charlotte, who bristled under the attention, though her pride had already begun to crumble. The other guests followed Elizabeth's lead, eyes moving from Eleanor to Charlotte, silently questioning where dignity truly resided. Eleanor did not gloat. She did not even look at Charlotte. Instead, she turned her gaze back to the window, where the sunlight now painted the courtyard with shifting patterns. Her voice was steady, unshaken. "I never wanted applause," she said softly. "I only wanted to raise my daughter. That was enough for me. More than enough." And yet in that moment applause came, not in the form of clapping, but in the form of silence so deep it became reverence. The lobby, once filled with chatter and clinking glasses, now felt like a sanctuary. Every pair of eyes saw Eleanor not as a janitor, not as background, but as a woman who had lived a life richer and braver than they had ever guessed. Elizabeth smiled, her tears slipping freely now, and whispered, "Thank you for sharing what was never asked." Eleanor inclined her head. Sometimes silence is a shield, but sometimes silence is just loneliness. Today, I chose to put it down. The words landed heavy and gentle all at once. Around the room, shoulders sagged with recognition, eyes softened with empathy, and hearts cracked open just a little wider. What no one yet knew was that this simple act, a janitor sitting with a guest and speaking of Paris, of love, of loss, of motherhood, was about to grow into something far larger. The ripple had only begun, and in its wake, lives would be rearranged, pride humbled, and hearts rewritten. For now, though, it was just a table by the window, two women holding hands, and a room full of strangers who, for the first time, felt less like strangers at all. The golden morning light stretched deeper into the lobby, making the marble glow as if it had absorbed every story whispered into its walls. Guests who moments before had been strangers now sat with a stillness that betrayed their eagerness, not to miss a single breath from the woman who had, in one quiet revelation, changed the rhythm of the day. Eleanor Grace no longer appeared to them as a shadow gliding through their footsteps. She was the quiet flame everyone was now circling around. Elizabeth's hand remained gently over Eleanor's, but her eyes wandered to the delicate glimmer that rested against Eleanor's chest. The locket, small and gold, caught the sunlight like a secret begging to be known. Elizabeth, who had lived long enough to understand that jewelry often carried entire lives inside it, tilted her head and asked softly, "That locket, may I?" The room leaned into the moment. It was not just Elizabeth who wanted to see. It was everyone. Each guest, each member of staff, each person who had walked past Eleanor for years without once considering her story. Every single one now held their breath. Eleanor paused, her fingers instinctively brushing over the locket, the gesture protective, almost sacred. Then, after a long silence, she unclasped the chain, lifting the small pendant into Elizabeth's hands. The hinge creaked faintly, as Elizabeth opened it. And there, behind the thin glass, was a photograph, faded at the edges, worn soft by years of touch, but still radiating life. It was a young woman in graduation robes, her smile so wide it seemed to spill out of the tiny frame. Pride shone in her eyes, the same pride Eleanor carried in her own. "My daughter," Eleanor said quietly, though her voice filled the lobby. "Ava, the first in our family to become a doctor." A ripple swept through the room. Gasps escaped before people could swallow them. The weight of that revelation, the image of a child lifted on the shoulders of sacrifice, settled into every heart present. The photograph was not just a portrait, it was proof. Proof that the woman polishing their floors had not been diminished by life, but had poured her strength into the soil of her daughter's success. Elizabeth's eyes brimmed with tears as she traced the photograph with a trembling finger. "She's beautiful," she whispered. Eleanor nodded, her lips curving with a smile that carried both joy and ache. "She is my joy." Every night I returned home exhausted, I looked at that picture. It reminded me why every step mattered. The photo passed from Elizabeth's hands to others who dared to lean closer. A man in a linen suit tilted the locket carefully, nodding with respect before passing it on. A woman near the fireplace held it longer, her chest rising and falling as she murmured something under her breath about her own daughter. Each guest, upon seeing Ava's face, seemed to find something of themselves reflected back. The entire lobby had transformed. What had once been a place of surface, fine pearls, polished shoes, soft music, was now heavy with meaning. Strangers were bound not by small talk, but by the shared recognition of love, sacrifice, and the enduring hope that children might live fuller lives than their parents. And then, as if drawn by something deeper than pride, Eleanor began to tell them more, not in a rehearsed speech, but in fragments of memory, pieces she had held in silence for years. She studied at the kitchen table while I mopped floors in the evening. She read her textbooks by the light of a lamp that flickered more often than it glowed. She carried second-hand books, but she carried them with dignity. And the day she was accepted to medical school, she called me and said, "Mama, we did it." Not just her, we. She always made sure I was part of her victory. The listeners were no longer blinking politely. Their eyes glistened, their breath shallow, their hearts moved by a truth that could not be polished away. Elizabeth closed the locket gently and returned it to Eleanor's palm, her own hand lingering there for a moment. "That picture," she said softly, "is not just your daughter's triumph. It is your legacy. It is everything you gave, wrapped into one smile." Eleanor bowed her head slightly, as though receiving a blessing. "I never needed the world to know," she murmured. "But it warms me that someone finally asked." At that moment, the sound of heels against marble broke the stillness. Charlotte Kingsley rose from her seat near the piano, her every step echoing through the lobby. Her posture was impeccable, her pearls catching the light, but her face was no longer composed with the certainty of wealth. There was something softer now, something unsettled. The crowd parted instinctively as she approached the table where Eleanor sat. No one spoke, no one moved. All eyes followed Charlotte as she crossed the distance, her heels clicking like a metronome marking the tension of the room. She stopped before Eleanor, standing taller, but not as sure of herself as before. The silence thickened. Her lips parted as if to speak, but she closed them again, struggling with the weight of what she wanted to say. And in that moment, before a word left her mouth, the world knew something extraordinary was about to happen. Because Charlotte Kingsley, who had opened the morning with cruelty, now stood trembling in the presence of a truth she could not mock, and what she would say next would not only shatter the marble walls of pride she had built around herself, but would change forever the way every guest in that lobby understood grace. The air itself seemed to lean forward, waiting. The Magnolia Grand lobby seemed to pulse with silence as Charlotte Kingsley stood before Eleanor Grace. It was the kind of silence that didn't ask for music or voices to fill it. It asked for truth. Every guest, every member of staff, every soul within those marble walls leaned forward in spirit, watching the moment unfold with hearts beating faster than they cared to admit. Charlotte's heels had carried her across polished stone countless times before, but never had they sounded so heavy. Never had they announced her approach with such finality. She had been the woman who entered a room with certainty, who expected the air to bend to her presence. And yet now, as she stood before Eleanor, her chest rose and fell with the uneven rhythm of someone stripped of her armor. For a moment she didn't speak. She looked at the mop leaning against the wall, at the bucket half filled with suds that had long since lost their bubbles. She looked at the locket still warm from Eleanor's hands, at the photograph inside that had touched every guest who dared to hold it. And finally, her eyes rose to Eleanor's face. Eleanor did not flinch. She didn't bow her head or avert her gaze. She simply looked back with the same calm she had carried all morning. The room, which had once laughed at Charlotte's mockery, now waited to see what she would do when stripped of her audience's approval. Charlotte opened her mouth, but the first sound that escaped was not her usual sharpness. It was thin, fragile, human. She stopped, swallowed, then tried again. I judged you. The words startled even her. They felt foreign on her tongue, like a language she had never practiced. Her lips trembled as she forced herself to continue. I judged you without knowing you. I thought myself above you, and I was wrong. The confession rolled across the room, heavy as stone, yet soft as confession in a chapel. Several guests glanced at one another in disbelief. This was Charlotte Kingsley, widow of an industrialist, a woman who had once ruled society teas and charity luncheons with ironclad elegance. And now she stood in the middle of a hotel lobby, voice unsteady, admitting fault to the woman she had mocked. She lowered her eyes, and in that gesture, her pearls suddenly looked less like a crown and more like chains. "May I?" she said carefully, her voice breaking at the edges. "May I sit with you too?" Gasps fluttered like birds in the rafters. No one had expected this. Apologies in her world were rare and certainly never given in public. To ask permission to sit at the same table as Eleanor was not just humility, it was surrender. A surrender not of status, but of pride. Elizabeth's hand tightened around Eleanor's, her heart swelling with both astonishment and hope. She looked to Eleanor, waiting to see if the woman she had come to admire in so short a time would accept the olive branch. Eleanor studied Charlotte for a long moment, not cruelly, not even cautiously, simply with the eyes of a woman who had spent her life seeing deeper than appearances. What she saw now was not the mocking figure by the piano, but a woman unmoored, stripped bare before strangers, asking for dignity she had once denied others. The room remained still. You could hear the faint buzz of the air conditioner, the creak of leather chairs as people leaned closer, the soft hum of the city outside muted by the glass. Every detail of the moment carved itself into memory. Finally, Eleanor spoke. Her voice was steady, low, but it carried like a hymn. "Yes, you may sit." Charlotte exhaled, a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Slowly, carefully, she lowered herself into the chair beside Elizabeth, across from Eleanor. For the first time in years, she sat not as a figure to be admired, but as a woman learning how to listen. Eleanor leaned slightly forward. Her words were not sharp. They were not triumphant. They were not even forgiving in the way people expected. They were something greater. "Everyone has a story," she said gently. "You just never asked mine." The phrase washed through the lobby like warm rain, soaking into every heart that had once walked past Eleanor without a glance. Heads bowed slightly, as if in silent agreement. It was not just for Charlotte, it was for them all. Charlotte's eyes filled with tears, though she blinked furiously to contain them. She pressed her hand against the table, steadying herself as if those words had shaken the very ground beneath her. "You're right," she whispered. "And I want to change that. I don't know how, but I want to." The admission hung there, raw and real. Elizabeth, her voice soft but sure, added, "Then perhaps it begins right here, with listening." Charlotte nodded slowly, her pearls shifting with the motion. No longer symbols of superiority, but reminders of the walls she had once built. She looked at Eleanor, not as someone lesser, not as background, but as the equal she had been blind to. Around them, something remarkable happened. Guests who had been content to remain spectators began to feel the stirring of reflection. They thought of the maids who made their beds, the drivers who carried their luggage, the women they passed in markets and never stopped to see. Eleanor's words had cracked something open, not only in Charlotte, but in every person present. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve and whispered, "Mama, she's like a queen." His voice carried further than he realized. and a few women smiled through tears. Eleanor did not correct him. She simply folded her hands and allowed the moment to be what it was. For Charlotte, the weight of her apology settled like an anchor, but for the first time she felt it was an anchor grounding her, not sinking her. She sat quietly listening, her sharp tongue silenced, her heart still trembling but open in a way it had not been in years. Eleanor, with her quiet strength, had not demanded an apology, nor sought to humiliate the woman who had mocked her. She had offered something rarer, dignity without condition, and that was more powerful than any lecture on kindness, more enduring than any sermon. It was grace itself, lived and breathed. The room remained silent a moment longer. Then a murmur began, not of gossip, but of reverence. Something had shifted in Charleston that morning, something that would ripple far beyond the hotel walls. And at the heart of it sat three women, hands resting on the same table, bound by a moment that none of them had expected, but all of them would remember. What no one knew was that the hotel itself was about to recognize the shift in a way that would surprise them all. The lobby of the Magnolia Grand, so often a place of rushing feet and practiced smiles, now resembled something closer to a chapel. People did not whisper as much as they prayed, their voices hushed not by rules but by reverence. What had begun with ridicule had blossomed into something else entirely, a lesson unfolding in real time, witnessed by strangers who felt themselves bound to one another by what they had just seen. Charlotte Kingsley sat with her pearls slightly askew, her eyes downcast, her posture no longer carved from pride, but softened by humility. The woman who once seemed untouchable now looked unmistakably human. She had apologized, and her apology, though halting, had been real. Yet it was not her words that carried the power of transformation. It was Eleanor's response. Eleanor did not scold. She did not raise her voice to remind Charlotte of the cruelty that had sparked the morning's events. She simply looked at her, steady as an oak, calm as still water, and said words that would echo through the room long after she rose from her chair. "Everyone has a story. You just never asked mine." The phrase lingered in the air, simple yet devastating. People shifted in their seats, not from discomfort with Eleanor, but from discomfort with themselves. How many times had they walked past women like her, maids in uniforms, cashiers behind counters, neighbors with tired eyes, and never thought to ask who they really were? The truth was not that Eleanor was extraordinary, though she was. The truth was that they had all been too blind to notice. A woman in her 60s sitting near the window pressed a handkerchief to her lips, tears catching in the corners of her eyes. She thought of her mother, long gone now, who had raised 6 children while scrubbing linens for wealthy families who never once invited her to sit at their tables. She thought of how rarely she herself had spoken her mother's name aloud, how much of that sacrifice had gone unrecognized. Another woman, younger, wrapped her arm around her elderly father. "You hear that, Papa?" she whispered. "Everyone has a story." He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on Eleanor with a mixture of regret and admiration. The manager of the hotel, a man in his 50s with graying hair neatly parted to the side, stood at the edge of the gathering. His arms were crossed, but not defensively. He was thinking, turning over in his mind every year Eleanor had worked under his roof, every holiday shift she had covered without complaint, every guest who had walked across the shine of her labor without once thanking her. He had known her name because payroll demanded it, but he had never known her story. And now, faced with the undeniable truth of her dignity, he felt something stir in him he had not expected. Shame, yes, but also pride. Eleanor's words did not strike like thunder. They landed like seeds. And even as she fell quiet, those seeds began to take root in the people around her. You could almost hear it, the subtle cracking of old habits, the soft breaking of walls built by class and assumption. Charlotte cleared her throat softly, lifting her eyes for the first time since she had asked to sit at Eleanor's table. Her voice, though small, carried a new note of sincerity. "I have spent my life being listened to," she admitted, "and yet I have done so little listening myself. You've shown me what I lost by not asking, by not seeing." Her hands trembled in her lap, but she did not try to hide them. Eleanor inclined her head gently, her expression neither triumphant nor dismissive. "It is never too late to see," she said. It was such a simple phrase, yet the effect was undeniable. People nodded, some pressing tissues to their eyes, others bowing their heads as though in silent prayer. The moment was not about pity for Eleanor, nor guilt for Charlotte. It was about recognition of the strength that had always been there, waiting, patient, unyielding, like stone beneath water. The lobby's air shifted. The flowers on the concierge desk seemed to stand taller. The soft hum of the piano in the corner grew richer, as though the keys themselves had absorbed the gravity of what had been spoken. The very space seemed changed by her quiet strength. Charlotte, once desperate to dominate, now sat still, her posture one of learning. And in her silence the room discovered something rare, the healing that comes not from grand gestures, but from humility shared between women, from the courage to speak and the grace to listen. Eleanor leaned back slightly in her chair, her hands folded once more in her lap. She did not need to add more. The lesson had already been given, not by shouting, not by demanding, but by standing firm in the truth of her life. Her dignity was not something she had just discovered. It had always been there. The only difference now was that the world had finally opened its eyes to it. Elizabeth, who had been silent for several minutes, finally spoke, her voice trembling with awe. "I believe we will not forget today. I believe we cannot." She squeezed Eleanor's hand as though to anchor the moment into flesh and memory. And though the morning had begun with laughter meant to humiliate, it now ended in silence that dignified, a silence that carried more weight than any applause. But the morning's transformation was not finished, because as Eleanor sat quietly, her presence reshaping the hearts of everyone in that room, the manager of the hotel cleared his throat. His voice broke into the hush, steady but filled with emotion. "Miss Grace," he said, his tone softer than anyone had ever heard from him before, "there is something I must say." And just like that, all eyes turned to him, waiting. The lesson of quiet strength was about to bear fruit in the most unexpected way. The hotel manager stood near the concierge desk, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes on Eleanor, as though seeing her for the first time. For years he had walked past her without pause, without thought. His words to her little more than directives about shifts or flaws to be polished. Yet now, faced with the truth that had unfolded before him, he felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest, a mix of guilt and admiration that made it difficult to breathe. The guests turned their heads toward him. Some leaned forward, expectant. The silence that followed his throat clearing was not the silence of disinterest. It was anticipation, heavy and almost reverent. It was as though the entire lobby waited to hear what he would do, what he would say, and whether he would rise to meet the gravity of the moment. He took a few steps forward, his polished shoes tapping against the marble, echoing in the stillness. His voice, usually brisk and professional, emerged slower this time, each word chosen with care. "Miss Grace," he said, his tone unusually gentle, "I have worked alongside you for 17 years. In all that time I have thought of you as steady, dependable and loyal. But today I realize I have been blind. I have seen your work, but I have not seen you, and for that I am deeply sorry." Eleanor's eyes lifted to meet his, calm as ever, though softened by the sincerity of his words. The manager hesitated, then continued, "It is not enough to apologize. Recognition is due, long overdue. This hotel has thrived in part because of your dedication, your unseen labor, your quiet strength. And today in front of these guests I would like to acknowledge it." A murmur ran through the room like wind moving across tall grass. Guests straightened in their chairs. A woman near the bar whispered, "Finally." The manager raised his hand slightly, calling for attention though he already had it. "Ladies and gentlemen, I would ask you to join me in recognizing Miss Eleanor Grace for her 17 years of loyal service to the Magnolia Grand. Without her, these floors would not shine, these halls would not welcome, and this building would not stand with the dignity it does." And then, in an act that surprised even himself, he began to clap. It started slowly, awkwardly even, the sound of a man unused to breaking the script of his role. But within moments the applause spread. Guests who only hours earlier had looked past Eleanor now rose to their feet. One by one, hands came together, filling the lobby with a sound richer than any music that had ever played on its piano. Some clapped with enthusiasm, others with tears in their eyes, but all with sincerity. Eleanor sat still, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes lowered not out of shame but humility. She had not sought this moment. She had not asked for it. yet it washed over her like a tide, unstoppable and cleansing. Elizabeth squeezed her hand, whispering through tears, "Do you see, my dear? They see you now." Charlotte, still seated nearby, joined the applause slowly, her palms meeting each other with hesitant grace. It was not performance, it was surrender. As the clapping swelled, something extraordinary happened. A bellboy approached, his youthful face flushed with nerves. He carried a small bouquet of lilies from the concierge desk. His hands shook as he offered them to Eleanor, his voice cracking as he said, "For you, Miss Grace." She accepted them with a smile so radiant it seemed to light the room more than the morning sun through the windows. "Thank you," she said softly, her words carrying further than anyone expected. Then, as if compelled by some invisible force, a guest stepped forward. He was an older man, dignified in a navy suit, who had been watching Eleanor with quiet respect since the beginning of the morning. He held the locket in his hand, the one that had passed from person to person. "May I frame this photograph for you?" he asked. "It deserves to be displayed, not hidden." Eleanor's lips trembled. She reached out and touched the photograph gently, as if it was skin rather than paper. "That would mean more than I can say," she replied. And then, from the back of the crowd, a boy no older than 12, clutching his mother's hand, stepped forward timidly. His voice wavered as he said, "Miss Grace, could I have your autograph?" The request startled the room. A few gasps, a few laughs of disbelief, but not mocking laughs this time. They were the astonished kind, the kind that bubbled up when something unprecedented broke through the ordinary. The boy held out a notepad and pen with trembling fingers, his cheeks red but his eyes shining with admiration. Eleanor blinked, stunned. "My autograph?" she repeated softly, almost to herself. "Yes," the boy said with childlike earnestness. "So I can remember today." Her hand shook as she took the pen, but her smile was steady. She signed her name slowly, carefully, as though the act itself carried weight she had never imagined. When she returned the pad to the boy, his face glowed with pride as though he had just met royalty. And in a way he had. The applause swelled again, filling the high ceilings, bouncing off the marble floors, carrying up the grand staircase and into the chandeliers. It was no longer simply recognition, it was celebration. For the first time in 17 years, Eleanor Grace was not just the janitor of the Magnolia Grand. She was its heart. She was seen. She was honored. She was celebrated. And though she accepted it with humility, her eyes lowering as her hands clasped the lilies, her presence in that chair radiated something undeniable. She was more than her uniform, more than her mop, more than her silence. She was a woman of grace, and at last the world was beginning to see it. But even in the midst of applause, Elizabeth leaned closer, her eyes glimmering with memory. She had not yet spoken her most startling thought, the flicker of recognition that had been tugging at her since Eleanor first spoke in French. And when she revealed it, the story would deepen further, unearthing a past connection that no one in the room could have predicted. The applause still echoed faintly across the marble lobby of the Magnolia Grand, reverberating as though the walls themselves had absorbed the sound. Slowly the guests began to settle again, their hands lowering, but the atmosphere remained charged with something rare and fragile. It was as if the air itself had been thinned, made lighter by the unveiling of Eleanor's truth. She sat with the bouquet of lilies in her lap, her hands folded around the stems, her smile quiet but luminous. She did not gloat in recognition, she simply received it with the dignity of one who had learned long ago that applause was never guaranteed. Elizabeth, seated close beside her, had been silent during the clapping. Her eyes had not left Eleanor's face, her expression caught between wonder and memory. There was something tugging at her, something deep within the folds of her recollection, like a thread waiting to be pulled. When the lobby fell back into stillness, she leaned forward, her voice hushed but clear enough for those nearby to hear. "Miss Grace," she began gently, "may I ask you something unusual?" Eleanor turned to her, her eyes warm, patient. "Of course." Elizabeth hesitated, her fingers trembling slightly as they toyed with the edge of her shawl. Then she asked, "Did you ever study at the Sorbonne, in Paris?" The question startled the room. A few guests exchanged glances, recognizing the name of the famed university. Eleanor's breath caught, her eyes widening in quiet shock. Slowly, she nodded. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying a weight that made even the chandeliers seem to lean closer. "I studied there, decades ago on scholarship. How could you know?" Elizabeth's face softened with a smile, both nostalgic and astonished. "Because I was there too. I was a guest lecturer in literature in the early 70s, and I remember you." The words struck like a soft bell in the silence. Gasps rippled through the listeners. Charlotte's lips parted, her eyes narrowing in disbelief while others leaned forward, eager not to miss a single detail. Eleanor blinked, stunned. "You remember me?" "Yes," Elizabeth said, her voice thick with emotion. "You were the young woman who sat in the front row of my lecture on Enlightenment philosophers. You debated Voltaire with such passion that half the room fell silent, and the other half applauded when you finished. I never forgot it. You had a fire in you, even then." The recollection brought color to Eleanor's cheeks, and for a moment she looked not like the janitor everyone thought they knew, but like the student she once had been, bright-eyed, brimming with possibility. The guests around them murmured with awe. A man near the fireplace whispered, "So it's true, she really lived it." A woman clutched her pearls, her eyes wet with tears, and said, "Imagine that. We never knew we were walking past history every day." Elizabeth leaned closer, her hand reaching for Eleanor's once more. "I remember writing in my notes that you were destined to change people's hearts. And here you are, still doing it, in ways perhaps you never imagined." Eleanor's lips trembled. She searched Elizabeth's face, the years peeling away as recognition sparked. "I do remember you now," she whispered. "You had a scarf, always silk, always tied just so. You said words could be both bread and fire." Elizabeth laughed softly, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "And you believed it. You carried that truth more than any of my students." The bond between them was undeniable, stretching across time and continents, weaving the past into the present with golden thread. The lobby, already captivated, was spellbound. It was not enough that Eleanor had revealed her story. Now someone had stepped forward to testify that it was true, that her brilliance had not been invented in the retelling, but had been witnessed, remembered, cherished across decades. Charlotte sat rigid, her pride unraveling further. She had mocked a woman who had once stood at the very heart of Parisian academia, a woman remembered by professors, a woman who carried not only a mop, but a history far richer than any she had imagined. Shame pressed heavy on her shoulders, but alongside it came something she had not felt in years: respect. Elizabeth, her hand still clasping Eleanor's, turned to the room. "Do you see? This woman was never invisible. She has always been remarkable. The failure was ours, not hers. We failed to ask, failed to see, failed to honor." The truth settled like a stone into every listening heart. The older women especially felt its weight. They knew what it meant to carry greatness in silence, to sacrifice dreams for family, to bury brilliance beneath necessity. Eleanor was not just one woman's story, she was a mirror of them all. Eleanor lowered her gaze, her voice soft but firm. "I am not remarkable because I studied philosophy in Paris, nor because I spoke French in this lobby. I am remarkable because I endured, because I chose love over ambition, because I kept going when life told me to stop. Every woman in this room has done the same in her own way." A hush fell once more, thicker than before, wrapping the room in reverence. Some wept openly, others pressed hands to their hearts. The truth Eleanor spoke was not grand or theatrical, it was ordinary, and that was what made it extraordinary. Elizabeth squeezed her hand. "Yes, my dear. But today we make sure the world remembers it. Not in whispers, not in silence, but in voices that will carry." And though Eleanor shook her head humbly, her eyes glimmered with tears. For the first time in decades, she was not carrying her story alone. Someone else had stepped forward to say, "I remember you. I saw you. I always knew you mattered." The lobby had begun the morning as a place of polished marble and casual cruelty. Now it had become something else entirely. A place where past and present intertwined, where forgotten dignity was restored, and where a woman long overlooked was finally being called by name. And that recognition was not the end of her story. It was the spark of something larger, something that would spread beyond those walls until the world itself began to listen. The days that followed the encounter in the Magnolia Grand Lobby seemed to move differently, as if the city itself had absorbed the weight of what had happened. Charleston, with its cobblestone streets and jasmine-scented air, had long been a city of stories, but this one had begun to ripple further than anyone could have expected. The guests who had witnessed Eleanor's quiet unveiling carried it with them like a sacred secret. They told it at dinner tables, whispered it to neighbors, repeated it over tea and coffee, until the tale no longer belonged to a single morning, but had become something larger, an awakening. The hotel manager, moved more deeply than he had anticipated, could not shake the image of Eleanor sitting among the guests, lilies in her lap, her voice steady as she spoke truths that humbled everyone in the room. For 17 years she had worked unseen, and he knew now that invisibility was a crime he had helped perpetuate. He resolved, quietly at first, that something must be done. Not a token gesture, not flowers or a card, but something lasting. Something that honored not only Eleanor but the dignity of every person who labored unseen. By the end of that week, an announcement went out to every guest and staff member. The Magnolia Grand would host a special evening in its ballroom, a celebration of unsung heroes, honoring those whose hands shaped lives in silence. At the center of it all would be Eleanor Grace. The night arrived bathed in candlelight and anticipation. The grand ballroom, usually reserved for galas of polished elites, shimmered in soft golds and creams. Crystal chandeliers glowed above tables draped in linen, and vases of fresh lilies stood in tribute to the bouquet Eleanor had received. Guests arrived dressed not in ostentation, but in reverence, as though they understood this evening required something different of them. When Eleanor entered, escorted gently by Elizabeth, the room rose to its feet. The applause was softer than the thunder of the lobby, yet deeper, carrying with it not surprise but intention. Eleanor wore a dress the color of sky just before dusk, simple yet elegant, with her silver-streaked hair tied back in a style that revealed the strength of her features. She walked not as a janitor, not even as a guest, but as a woman stepping fully into her rightful place. Charlotte Kingsley was there, seated in the front row, holding a bouquet of roses in her lap. Her presence was quiet, her pearls worn not as armor but as reminder, each one a bead of humility she was still learning to string together. She had insisted on sitting close, not to reclaim attention, but to ensure Eleanor saw that her respect was genuine. The hotel manager stepped to the podium first, his voice uncharacteristically warm as he welcomed everyone. He spoke of service, of labor done in shadows, of stories overlooked. And then, with deliberate care, he said, "Tonight we honor Miss Eleanor Grace. She has been the backbone of this hotel for nearly 2 decades, but more than that, she is a woman whose life reminds us that greatness is not measured by titles or wealth, but by sacrifice, by love, by endurance. She is not our janitor tonight, she is our guest of honor." The applause swelled again, guests rising to their feet once more. Eleanor stood slowly, her hand resting briefly on Elizabeth's before she walked toward the stage. Her steps were steady, her presence commanding without effort. The microphone waited, gleaming beneath the lights, but the hush that fell as she approached told her she needed no microphone at all. She took a breath, and when she spoke, her voice carried with the clarity of bells across the room. "I thank you for this kindness," she began, her tone calm but resonant. "For 17 years I have worked in this building. I have swept its floors, polished its marble, and watched its guests come and go. Most days I was invisible, and I did not mind, because I was working for something greater than myself. My daughter." She paused, her eyes softening. "She is the reason I rose each morning, the reason I bent my back and stilled my tongue. She is a doctor now. She heals what is broken. She is my pride. But what I want you to understand is this. I did not raise her alone. Every unseen worker in every place contributes to a world that allows others to rise. The food you eat, the clothes you wear, the rooms you sleep in, someone's hands made them ready. We are all held by invisible hands, and those hands deserve to be honored too." The words fell into the room like seeds into fertile soil. Guests bowed their heads, some openly crying, others clutching at one another's hands. Eleanor did not speak with bitterness, nor with accusation. She spoke with gratitude and dignity, her words stitching together the invisible threads that connected them all. "I am grateful for this recognition," she continued, "but more than applause, I hope you carry with you a new way of seeing. When you pass the woman who cleans your table or the man who drives your bus, Do not just see the uniform. Ask their story. For in every story, there is something to honor. Her voice caught just slightly, but she pressed on. Kindness is not something you wear on the outside. It is something you do, something you choose, again and again. The room erupted in applause, not the shallow clapping of obligation, but the thunder of hearts breaking open. People stood, cheering through their tears, their faces illuminated by the simple truth they had been given. Charlotte rose with them, her bouquet trembling in her hands. She pressed it to her chest, whispering words no one else heard. "Thank you for teaching me." Eleanor stepped back from the microphone, her hands clasped before her, her eyes lowered humbly. Yet every person in the room saw her differently now. She was no longer the woman who polished their floors. She was the one who had polished their hearts. The night did not end with dessert or music, but with conversations that lingered deep into the evening. Guests spoke to staff they had never noticed before, asking names, hearing stories, sharing laughter. Something had shifted permanently, and it began with a single woman who chose to speak after years of silence. And though Eleanor herself would return to her duties in days to come, she would never again be unseen. She had been called forth, honored, celebrated, and the echo of her words would travel far beyond Charleston, carried by the voices of those who had heard them. What Eleanor did not yet know was that someone had recorded her speech, and soon her message would travel further than she could have imagined, across screens, across borders, into millions of homes. Her quiet strength was about to become a voice for the world. The ballroom slowly emptied that night, but the echoes of Eleanor's words clung to the air like the lingering perfume of lilies. Guests left not in their usual rush to return to schedules and obligations, but in slow, thoughtful steps, as though reluctant to let go of what they had witnessed. They carried her words with them, repeating them under their breath, inscribing them quietly into memory. Kindness isn't something you wear, it's something you do. The phrase was simple enough to be remembered, yet profound enough to feel like scripture. Unbeknownst to Eleanor, one of the younger guests, an art student visiting Charleston with her parents, had recorded the entire speech on her phone. She hadn't planned it. Something in her told her it needed to be remembered, that the world outside this ballroom might need to hear the words spoken by the woman in the sky blue dress. Later that evening, in her hotel room, the young woman uploaded the clip with a caption that read, "This is Miss Eleanor Grace. She taught me more about dignity in 10 minutes than most people do in a lifetime." By morning, the video had traveled further than anyone expected. First, it was shared among friends and family, then reposted on local community pages. Within hours, it spread to larger platforms, reaching people far beyond Charleston. Views multiplied by the thousands, then tens of thousands. Within days, it crossed into millions. The comments poured in like waves. "She reminds me of my grandmother. This is the wisdom the world has forgotten. I want to be like her when I grow old." Mothers tagged daughters, daughters tagged mothers. Families sat together in kitchens and living rooms, replaying Eleanor's voice as though it were an old hymn rediscovered. Eleanor herself knew nothing of it at first. She woke the next morning to the familiar rhythm of her work, her mop in hand, her body moving with the same steady grace that had carried her through decades. She had not sought an audience, and she did not crave one now. But as she made her rounds through the hotel, she noticed something different. Guests greeted her not with polite nods, but with warm smiles, with handshakes, with voices that spoke her name aloud. "Good morning, Miss Grace." "Thank you, Miss Grace. We saw you last night. You were wonderful." It was disorienting at first, the sudden shift from invisibility to recognition. She had lived so long in the shadows of service that the light of attention felt both tender and overwhelming. But she received it as she received everything, calmly, humbly, with eyes that glimmered not with pride, but with gratitude. Elizabeth was the one who told her about the video. She found Eleanor in the lobby, polishing the marble with her usual care, and sat beside her. "My dear," she said softly, handing her a tablet. "You must see this." Eleanor frowned, wiping her hands on her apron before taking the device. On the screen was her own face, captured beneath the golden glow of the ballroom chandeliers. She pressed play, and her own voice filled the air. She listened, her lips pressing together, her brow furrowing. It felt strange to watch herself, to hear her words outside the walls that had held them. She almost didn't recognize the woman in the video, the steadiness in her voice, the weight of her presence. When she looked up, her eyes shimmered with disbelief. "Why would anyone care to share this?" she asked. Elizabeth took her hand. "Because truth, spoken with grace, is a rare thing, and when the world hears it, it remembers what it has been missing." Eleanor shook her head gently, still unsure, but the truth was already out of her hands. The video continued to spread, making its way into newspapers, onto television segments, into sermons and classrooms. Writers quoted her. Pastors repeated her words from pulpits. Teachers played the clip to students, asking them what kindness meant. Her phrase, "Kindness isn't something you wear, it's something you do," became a refrain in conversations across the country. The effect reached far beyond praise. People began to act. A woman in Ohio wrote that she had visited the retirement home where her mother lived and sat to listen to the stories of the staff she had ignored. A teacher in Texas shared that her students started a kindness board after watching the video. A nurse in Chicago said she carried Eleanor's phrase with her during long shifts, reminding herself that kindness was not in her scrubs, but in the way she touched each patient's hand. For Eleanor, it was almost too much. She had lived quietly for so long that the idea of her words traveling across oceans and screens felt unreal. Yet, as Elizabeth reminded her gently, she had not been made famous by chance. She had been revealed by truth, and perhaps the most profound effect of all was closer to home. In Baltimore at Johns Hopkins, Dr. Ava Thomas, Eleanor's daughter, sat in her office scrolling through her phone after a long shift. She stumbled across the video, recognizing her mother's voice before she saw her face. Her eyes filled with tears as she listened to the words, as she watched the world finally see what she had always known, that her mother was extraordinary. When the video ended, Ava pressed her hand against her chest, whispering into the empty room, "Mama, the world finally knows." For the first time in her life, Eleanor's story was no longer hidden under silence. It was out in the world, carried in voices, echoed in actions. And though Eleanor herself remained the same, steady, humble, faithful, the world around her had begun to change. The daughter who had once been the reason for her labor was about to become the reason for her celebration. Because when Ava returned home, the story of Eleanor Grace would reach its most tender chapter yet. The video of Eleanor Grace's words had traveled farther than anyone in Charleston could have dreamed, but its most profound destination was not across oceans or onto television screens. It was in a quiet office in Baltimore, where Dr. Ava Thomas sat hunched over her desk after a long day at Johns Hopkins. The glow of the screen lit her tired face as she watched, transfixed, the figure of her mother standing in a ballroom, speaking with the strength of someone who carried generations of sacrifice in her chest. Ava had always known her mother was remarkable, but to see the world finally acknowledge it brought tears that would not stop falling. She replayed the video twice, then 3 times. Each time, her chest tightened with both pride and guilt. Pride that her mother's voice had become a beacon for so many, guilt that she had never realized how much her mother had buried to lift her up. She whispered to the empty room, her voice trembling, "Mama, everything I am is because of you. And now, they see it too." Within a week, Ava arranged her schedule and returned home. The hotel had planned another event, this time not just to honor Eleanor, but to celebrate her as the heart of a movement that had grown beyond Charleston. What began as a single video had inspired letters, donations, and messages from around the world. The Magnolia Grand, once just a place of polished surfaces, had become a symbol of transformation, and Eleanor stood at its center. On the evening of the celebration, the ballroom once again filled with guests. This time, however, the atmosphere was different. It was not tinged with surprise or the humility of revelation. It was radiant with joy. The lilies were brighter, the chandeliers seemed to sparkle more warmly, and the air carried the hum of expectation, the sense that something unforgettable was about to unfold. Eleanor entered wearing a soft dress of deep rose, her locket resting against her chest. The room erupted into applause before she had even reached the front. She smiled shyly, still unaccustomed to such recognition, her steps graceful but modest. She carried herself as she always had, steady, humble, but now the world met her stride with reverence. Charlotte Kingsley was there again, this time without the stiffness of pearls as armor. She wore a simpler gown, her hair looser, her expression tender. She held no bouquet tonight, but carried something far heavier, the resolve to remain changed, to honor the lesson she had been given. Elizabeth, radiant in her sea-glass shawl, stood close to Eleanor as though guarding the bond they had forged, her eyes brimming with anticipation. When Eleanor was invited to the stage, she began with gratitude, thanking those who had chosen to see her, thanking those who worked beside her in silence, and thanking her daughter, who had given her life purpose. Her voice was steady, but her eyes searched the crowd, waiting for the moment her heart longed for most. Then it happened. From the side of the ballroom, the doors opened and Ava entered. Her white doctor's coat had been traded for a navy dress that brushed her knees, but the confidence of her stride carried the strength of the profession she had earned. The moment she appeared, a murmur swept through the room. People recognized her from the locket's faded photograph, now come to life before their eyes. Eleanor's breath caught. For a moment, she could not move. The years of labor, the nights of exhaustion, the prayers whispered in silence, all of it culminated in the sight of her daughter walking toward her, tears streaming down her face. "Mama," Ava whispered as she reached the stage, her voice breaking as she embraced her mother before the entire room. "Everything I am, everything I've built, is because of you. Tonight, I stand here not as a doctor, but as your daughter, proud to be the fruit of your sacrifice." The embrace held the room captive. Guests wiped their eyes, some openly weeping, others pressing tissues to trembling lips. Even Charlotte, who had once laughed cruelly, now wept quietly, her tears falling without restraint. Eleanor held her daughter tightly, her body trembling with joy she had never allowed herself to imagine. "Ava," she whispered back, "you were always the dream I never let die. I only ever wanted to see you rise." When they pulled apart, hand in hand, the room erupted. Applause thundered, cheers rang out, and the chandelier light seemed to shimmer brighter as if celebrating with them. People rose to their feet, some shouting Eleanor's name, others calling Ava's, but all united in the recognition that what they were witnessing was not just a reunion, it was a fulfillment. Eleanor turned to the crowd, tears streaming freely now, and said, "You see before you not my achievement, but my blessing. My daughter is proof that no sacrifice is wasted, no quiet labor unseen by God. She is my joy, and tonight I share her with you." Ava added softly, "And tonight I give her back to you, as a teacher, a guide, a reminder of what true grace looks like." The applause deepened, rolling like a wave through the ballroom. People shouted words of affirmation. "Bless her! What a woman! What a mother!" The sound rose to the ceiling and seemed to linger there, caught in the crystal, refusing to fade. For Eleanor, this was the moment she had never dared to expect. Not the applause, not the recognition, not even the global attention. It was the embrace of her daughter witnessed by the world, a public acknowledgement of the bond that had defined her life. And as she stood there, hand in hand with Ava, her heart swelling with gratitude, she knew that nothing in the years ahead could ever diminish this night. It was the fulfillment of a promise, the full circle of a life lived in quiet strength and revealed at last in radiant truth. But even as the celebration soared, one more gift waited for her. A gift not of applause or reunion, but of permanence. A gesture that would etch her presence into the very fabric of the Magnolia Grand, ensuring that long after the applause faded, her name and her grace would remain. The celebration ended with embraces, with laughter through tears, with people who once passed each other as strangers suddenly speaking like family. Eleanor stood with Ava at her side, receiving words of gratitude that seemed to fall upon her like blessings. By the time the last guest had left the ballroom and the chandeliers dimmed, the hotel no longer felt like the same place. It was no longer a building of marble and polished brass. It had become a vessel of memory, forever changed by what it had witnessed. In the weeks that followed, life returned to its rhythm in Charleston. Guests came and went, the piano in the lobby resumed its gentle melodies, and the staff went about their duties. Yet something was different. People lingered a little longer in the lobby, their conversations softer, their gazes more thoughtful. It was as though Eleanor's presence had left an imprint on the very air, a reminder that dignity lives in places often ignored. The manager of the Magnolia Grand, still moved by the events, gathered the staff together one afternoon. "There are many ways to honor a person," he said, his voice steady but filled with feeling. "But some honors must live where they were born. Miss Grace changed this hotel, and I believe her name should stay here even when her footsteps no longer echo across our floors. Plans were made quietly, carefully, with reverence. The decision was not for another gala or public speech. This time, it would be something smaller, more enduring, something woven into the fabric of the hotel itself, a gesture of permanence." On a bright morning, when the air carried the scent of magnolia blossoms drifting from the trees outside, Eleanor was invited into the lobby. Ava walked beside her, Elizabeth just behind, and even Charlotte was present, her expression open and tender, her usual guarded pride softened into something almost gentle. The staff gathered too, the bellboys, the housekeepers, the waiters who had long admired her in silence, but now looked at her with pride. Near the grand piano where everything had begun, the place where laughter had once cut like a knife, but had since been redeemed, stood a lounge chair, newly polished, upholstered in warm fabric. At first glance it seemed ordinary, no different from the others scattered around the lobby. But as Eleanor drew closer, she saw the small plaque fixed carefully to its wooden arm. Her steps slowed. Her hand trembled as she reached out to touch it. The engraving gleamed softly in the morning light, the letters etched with care. "In honor of Miss Eleanor Grace, for teaching us what grace looks like." The room was silent, waiting for her reaction. Eleanor's throat tightened as she traced the letters with her fingertips, her vision blurring with tears she did not try to hold back. She sank into the chair slowly, as though it were not merely a seat, but a throne of memory, of recognition, of permanence. Guests passing through the lobby paused, curious, and then hushed as they realized what they were witnessing. Some smiled, others pressed their hands over their hearts. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve and whispered, "That's her chair." The word spread quickly, and soon people were speaking of it as if it were sacred ground. From that day forward, the chair became more than furniture. It became a gathering place. Guests would pause by it, greeting Eleanor by name if she sat there, or pausing even in her absence to read the plaque, to remember. Children would wave at her, asking questions in innocent curiosity. Travelers took photographs, not of chandeliers or marble floors, but of the chair that honored the woman who had reminded them all of kindness. Eleanor accepted it not as a pedestal, but as a gift. She would sit there in the mornings before beginning her work, sipping coffee offered by the staff, sometimes sharing stories with Elizabeth, sometimes simply watching the world pass by with Ava at her side. And sometimes, when Charlotte visited, they would sit together, two women once divided by cruelty, now bound by humility and forgiveness, sharing not just coffee, but conversations about children, about aging, about the fragile yet beautiful ties that bind people together. Eleanor often spoke softly to Ava in those moments, words meant as both reflection and lesson. "This chair," she would say, brushing her hand over the plaque, "is not about me. It is about every person whose story has gone unheard. It reminds people to listen, to ask, to see. Promise me, Ava, you'll carry that forward." And Ava, tears glistening in her eyes, always nodded. "I promise, Mama." In time, the chair became part of the lore of the Magnolia Grand. Guests would tell new visitors, "You must see Eleanor's chair." Some would sit briefly, not in mockery, but in reverence, whispering to themselves her words about kindness. The plaque, small and unassuming, carried more weight than any painting or sculpture in the building. For Eleanor, the greatest gift was not the applause she had once received, nor the video that had carried her words across the world. It was this chair, a symbol that she could leave behind, rooted in the very place where she had been invisible for so long. It was proof that quiet strength endures, that love lived out in silence can still echo louder than cruelty, louder than pride, louder even than laughter meant to wound. And so each morning she sat near the piano where her story had changed course. Sometimes she would whisper a phrase in French, remembering the girl who had once walked the Seine. Sometimes she would close her eyes, remembering the man who never returned but left her with a gift greater than love, a daughter. And sometimes she would simply sit, her hands folded over her locket, listening to the footsteps of strangers who, because of her, walked with a little more gentleness. Eleanor Grace had been overlooked once, but no longer. She had become, in her own quiet way, the most powerful person in the room. And though time would pass and seasons would change, the chair by the piano remained, engraved with her name, carrying her legacy, a reminder that sometimes the people the world tries hardest to overlook are the very ones who teach it what true grace looks like. The story had begun with a laugh meant to belittle. It ended with a name carved in permanence. And in between, it taught everyone who listened that kindness is not decoration. It is choice. It is courage. It is love lived out day by day in the lives of those who refuse to be broken. Eleanor Grace was no longer unseen. She was unforgettable.